Bilateral negotiations between Russia and Ukraine were called off over the weekend. Next week, the U.S. will join trilateral discussions in Abu Dabhi on Wednesday and Thursday. Meanwhile, it's still unknown if Russia will make good on a week-long ceasefire on energy infrastructure. Irregardless, Russia has stepped up attacks on civilians, killing 15 miners in a bus in the Dnipropetrovsk region on Sunday. Now, joining me to discuss this and more is Mark Toth, co-founder of Interp 360. Hello, Mark, and thanks so much for joining us on on World News Tonight.
Don, great to see you. Great to be back. Thank you.
Yes, so these bilateral talks were called off over the weekend, moved to trilateral talks on Wednesday and Thursday. The big hurdles are the territory in the Donbass and the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. Do you see any glimmer of hope of a compromise being reached?
Don, I don't. Look, there was some kabuki theater this week, again, going on. Speaking of Nagoya, place that I lived as a young child in Japan, between Putin and President Zelensky. Putin, through Emirov, was basically saying, come to Moscow, we can negotiate this. Zelensky's not that dumb. He's not going to sign his own death warrant for traveling to Moscow. And so he, in turn, tweaked Putin and said, come to Kiev if you dare. That tells me that a lot of the reasons that this bilateral broke down is that there's just no concurrence or even close to a concurrence of agreement on how to treat the Donbass in that regard. I know many have suggested that the military buildup, the U.S. military buildup in Iran is one reason these were postponed. I doubt that. I think the U.S. is still in a building up phase there. I don't think that's what has happened. The thing that has my attention right now in terms of how these move forward, to answer your question, is this surprise visit from Kirill Dmitriev, Putin's special envoy to the United States, to Miami over night, where he met with Steve Witkoff, the U.S. negotiator representing Trump. That's concerning to me because it tells me this. Whenever the Russians feel that Zelensky's getting the upper hand in these negotiations, Kirill Dmitriev pops back up in the picture, and he just did. Tried to find out what was said, can't find out. At this point, all we know is they claim, at least Witkoff does, I say that skeptically, that they were constructive and useful.
When it comes to Steve Witkoff, I'm just curious, maybe you have an opinion on this. Is there a time when President Donald Trump might lose patience with the progress or lack thereof, is typically what we're seeing from Steve Witkoff, that he could potentially maybe be replaced?
Don, I'd hope so. I just don't believe that we're there at this point in time. Look, Steve Witkoff is a guy that basically is an economic guy by background, commercial real estate developer, views these negotiations very much from an economic standpoint of view. So when he and Kirill Dmitriev get together like they did before and in previous meetings, it's almost like in a bad mafia movie where Kirill Dmitriev's role is to be the money bag guy, to bring the the promises of Russian riches in a post-war environment to Steve Witkoff to try to get concessions from the Trump administration. I think that's a message, though, in theory, that Trump likes to hear. He wants to see the world in an economic viewpoint, wants to see past the war prematurely, mind you, and thinks that this is all about ultimately striking a business deal. It didn't work for the European Union in terms of how you approached oil and energy channels for you, and it won't work for the U.S. in any kind of long-term arrangement if we think we can strike a similar business deal. Putin's not interested in business deals. He's interested in Ukraine, and ultimately he's interested in Eastern Europe, including Poland, unfortunately.
Well, Donald Trump, the Trump administration, has said a good deal would mean that neither side is 100% happy. Both will have to make concessions. Can you envision such a situation when it comes to the Donbass and Zaporizhzhia? Is there something that's not being discussed right now that could potentially be a way for both sides to get there?
Yeah, Don, it's a great question, but it's a difficult one to answer because I do think, and it concerns me as an analyst, there's been slippage in how we describe this territory in the Donbass as fortress belt lines that are so key to Ukraine's defense, that protects Sumy, protects Kharkiv, protects Odessa, and protects Kiev from Russian advances, is that we tend to talk about them anymore as Ukrainian occupied territory. Newsflash, it's not occupied territory. It's Ukrainian sovereign territory. And I think that's the big dilemma here, is that the ask that Trump is asking and that Putin is demanding of Zelensky is to cede this sovereign territory. And that's just not likely to happen. I still think, despite the horrific costs, human costs that's going on in Ukraine, that if that's put to a referendum, Ukrainians are going to say no. Look, they know in 2014 that didn't work with the Donbass and in terms of Crimea. Putin only came back in 2022. It's fool's gold to think that. Yes, security guarantees would be great, but unless there's a robust post-war force along any kind of demilitarized zone, I don't see it working. And I think the pushback should be, if Russia wants a demilitarized zone, then let's build it inside of Russia. Put it there. Don't argue that somehow Ukraine has to give up its sovereign territory. That's just madness. It didn't work in the lead up to World War II. It's not going to work now.
According to a report from CSIS, since February of 22, Russian forces have suffered nearly 1.2 million casualties, more losses than any major power in any war since World War II. Now, after seizing the initiative in 2024, Russian forces have also only advanced at an average rate of between 15 and 70 meters per day in their most prominent offensives. So slower than almost any major offensive campaigns that we have seen in war in the last century. Now, what does that say about Russia's war in Ukraine? How many more losses can Russia take?
Yeah, I think it's a question, and it's a great point that you're making, because if you compare it to World War II, look, Stalin, someone that Putin likes to model himself after these days, and marched all the way to Berlin in the same time period and conquered Nazi Germany in part. So far, in most guidelines, maybe, in most assessments, I should say, maybe Putin has advanced 50 to 70 kilometers in any given area of eastern Ukraine. It's been a dismal failure. The one thing, though, that he's willing to keep doing, unfortunately, if you're a Russian, is to keep throwing young Russian soldiers into this meat grinder. And as you said, it's accurate. 1.2 million have either been killed or maimed in this war that's going nowhere. And to have accomplished what? They basically gather, slightly less than 80% of the Donbass. It's been a strategic failure. But at this point, we just don't see any signs that Putin is willing to back off of that. He's willing to keep spending Russian lives to do it, even though his economy is in shambles, even though he's killing his own people, even though Russia's economy eventually is going to implode because of trapped economic growth. It's just a bubble because of the war economy that they're in. There's nothing good for Russia in the long run. And I think that almost forces him, in a kind of in a dystopian way, to keep fighting a war, because stopping it would be a disaster for him, economically, militarily, and probably lead to his demise.
Absolute madness. Well, Mark Toth, I appreciate the discussion. Always enjoy having you on. Thanks for joining us on World News Tonight.
Thank you, Don. Take care. Good night to you and your viewers.
And that concludes this edition of World News Tonight. Thank you for joining us. Have a great evening, and hope to see you next time. Good night.